What is going on, Commanders Nation? Command this podcast family. It's your boy Steve coming at you with a quick slant. It's the off season, news is slow, and we haven't done a quick slant in quite some time. And you know what? I never get the opportunity to talk to you guys one-on-one. I love my co-hosts, Deb and Phil, but this is me getting a little bit off my chest that I've been thinking about for a while. So the purpose of this episode is I'm going to quickly talk about why John Matsko was really fired, and what does it mean when you contrast that with the Air Coryell system, which John Matsko was born and bred in, with the new West Coast RPO style offense that Eric Bienemy is bringing to the table here in Washington. So this took about 2 weeks worth of research, off for about 15 minutes or less worth of content, but I promise you'll enjoy it. Please stick with me and let's get on with this journey. Okay, so for those who are not aware, John Coryell, he is the pioneer of the offense known as the Air Coryell system. The offense emphasized the vertical passing game. We've seen it in Washington here in the past, and I'll get to that here in a minute. It was definitely a pass-first offense, and unlike many other playbooks in the late 70s and 80s, which were very run-heavy, run-centric, John Coryell was changing the game before a game needed to be changed. His offense was based around a gentleman named Sid Gilman, and the offense made the opposing defense defend the entire field, not just a simple field. It was based on timing and rhythm between the quarterback and all the receivers. And John Coryell later expanded that offense by putting receivers in motion and not to allow cornerbacks to press the receivers off of the line. And he also put tight ends and running backs in motion as well, which was unheard of back in the 70s and the 80s. And putting players in motion at that time helped allow the quarterback to tell what sort of defense were they in, what scheme were they in, man or specifically zone coverage, because that was very important. And so no one was doing it back then till John Coryell came on the scene. And since the passing system was really based on timing and rhythm, the ball was thrown to a specific spot, and the receiver had to get there to catch the ball. The receivers had usually around 3 different routes they could run depending on the coverage of the defense. Looking for the deep ball was always the first option in John Coryell's system. Then working your way through progression if the deep ball was not there, taken away, or covered. But John Coryell loved getting 5 players out for passing routes. We don't see it that often. You definitely didn't see it that often back in the 70s and 80s. But he wanted 3 things in his offense specifically. He wanted a strong inside running game and the ability to strike deep with 2 vertical threats. And then he wanted a solid mid-range passing game. So those are the 3 things he wanted. And back then, tight ends were usually used as blockers. Okay. I'm talking late 70s, 80s. But not in John Coryell's scheme, in the Air Coryell system. He wanted his tight ends to be weapons and threats on the field. And as a result, if you know Kellen Winslow Sr., he was used as a receiver, and a very effective one in that system, I might add. He would be set in motion and also lined up in the slot, which is, you just didn't do that with tight ends back then. But Kellen Winslow Sr. was not your usual traditional tight end per se. But back in the 80s, the defense would use linebackers or strong safety to cover tight ends. And Winslow, the dude was like 6'5", 250 pounds. He would just dominate them all. And then later in 1980, the Chargers acquired a guy named Chuck Muncie. And so John Coryell started using single back sets. And then he would bring in a second tight end. And if the defense countered this by bringing in extra defensive back, he would just run the ball. It was very similar to like a cat and mouse chess game. So I bring in 2 tight ends. Oh, you're going to bring in extra DBs or linebackers. Extra DBs. I'm going to run the ball. You're going to sub out linebackers. Oh, my tight ends are now going to exploit your linebackers. And so the same way boxers set up the jab, set up the right cross with the jab, is the same way John Coryell tried to set up the bringing in the 2 tight end sets as weapons. That way he had choices on the field. And why does this all matter? When John Matsko got fired, I feel like it just got swept under the rug. And so the intelligence analyst in me and this is just what I do, I want to find out the why. And it's probably not that important, but to me it was. So all this analysis and research done is really just to find out, why did they fire him? And why was it so quiet? And was he really not a fit for Eric Bienemy? But back to the lecture at hand. Dan Fouts. You guys know Hall of Fame quarterback Dan Fouts, right? He flourished significantly in the Air Coryell system. That man threw for almost 33,000 yards and 210 touchdowns. He also threw for 4,000 yards in 3 consecutive seasons in the Air Coryell system. It wasn't even a challenge for him back then. Also, I talked about Hall of Fame tight end Kellen Winslow. That man caught 488 passes and 42 touchdowns and had 3 seasons of 80 plus receptions in the Air Coryell system. And we're talking a tight end here, guys. Next up, Charlie Joyner. Charlie Joyner, also a Hall of Famer, caught 500 passes for 7,600 yards in 3 consecutive seasons of 1,000 yards. Are you guys getting what I'm putting down about the Air Coryell system? It was kind of ahead of its time. And then there's the beloved Joe Jackson Gibbs. I don't know if that's his middle name or not, but that's what we're calling him tonight. Joe Gibbs, our awesome coach of the Washington Redskins, who has 3 Super Bowls in DC. He was the offensive coordinator under Don Coryell on the Chargers when Don Coryell was the coach. And he took the Air Coryell offense, brought it to DC in 1981. I said it a second ago. He won 3 Super Bowls running this offense, but Joe Gibbs incorporated a few of his own sprinkles into the Air Coryell system. Now, Joe Gibbs also liked more of a power running game and 3 receivers set. So Monk, Clark, Sanders, the posse, 3 of the greatest to do it ever. And remember, we also saw the counter tray run by Washington and under Gibbs, pulling guards, very moving the line around, and also the birth of the hog. So it was kind of an Air Coryell hybrid. We had big guys who could move in space. So, and then there was Mike Martz, former head coach. He also thrived using concepts of the Air Coryell system, also known as the greatest show on turf, if you ever heard of it. Norv Turner, head coach of the Redskins, also offensive coordinator from the Panthers under Coach Ron Rivera, also ran similar concepts to the Air Coryell. And his son, Scott Turner, who we'll talk about in a second. And we'll talk a little about Marty and Norv here in a minute too. But Don Coryell was a game changer. He won 65 games in 5 seasons with the Chargers. And on February 9th, just this past February, it was announced he was going to be enshrined into the NFL Hall of Fame. So my hat's off to you, Don Coryell, for changing the system. All right, back to me. Now let's break down the differences between the West Coast offense and the Air Coryell system. We kind of already talked about some of these points, but I think they're worth bringing up again. So the West Coast offense, like the one made famous by Bill Walsh, the great coach of the San Francisco 49ers and previously Stanford, 2 distinct systems in American football. Each, they have their own nuances and special characteristics and philosophies, but the main difference is what I really want you to get at. And so for the passing philosophies, the Air Coryell offense is known for aggressive vertical passing attack and stretching the field and taking shots down the field. It emphasizes deep throws, long pass routes, and exploiting mismatches in coverage between a cornerback, safety, and or wide receiver. But in contrast, when you look at the West Coast offense as we know it today, it places a greater emphasis on short horizontal passes and precision timing of routes. Okay, precision timing. It focuses specifically on quick, high percentage throws that move the ball efficiently down the field. So it's essentially the same as the Air Coryell offense, but flip the field from vertical to horizontal. So Air Coryell focusing on the vertical, West Coast offense focusing horizontal. Okay, keep that in mind. Number 2, the route concepts. Okay, the Air Coryell offense features, we talked about a second ago, way more vertical routes such as deep post goes, sideline fades, and you're attacking the defense vertically. Okay, it relies on the one-on-one coverages and hopes that the receiver will exploit those one-on-one matchups and make a big play downfield. Okay, the West Coast offense incorporates a variety of much shorter timed routes such as slants, bang, bang, as Jay Gruden used to say, crosses, option routes, all these emphasize precision timing between the quarterback and receivers. Okay. And remember, under the Air Coryell system under Scott Turner, you're supposed to have a live arm. And we really thought Carson Wentz was that live arm before we saw what Carson Wentz really was. The third thing I want to talk about, the play action and the run pass balance. Okay. You're going to hear a lot of different philosophies when you're comparing Air Coryell and the West Coast offense, but here's my spin on it. And while they both use play action passing, the Air Coryell relies on it to a lesser extent. Okay. Hear me out. The West Coast offense employs play action fakes and uses the threat of the running game to open up passing lanes and creates opportunities for those receivers. Okay. Similar to what we talked about earlier, boxer setting his right cross up with his jab, run, short pass, bam, I'll hit you with the intermediate or long pass in the West Coast offense. It tends to have a more balanced attack between the run and the pass. Okay. Personnel usage. Okay, this is kind of a big one. This is the fourth one. The Air Coryell relies a lot on a quarterback with a live arm who can get the ball downfield and make those deep throws, as well as receivers with speed and, like I said before, the ability to win those one-on-one matchups with those defensive backs. And we thought we had it with Carson Wentz. Okay, we didn't really have it with Taylor Heineke, but he tried really hard. The West Coast offense focuses on the timing and precision, and it places a premium from a quarterback's perspective on the quarterback's decision-making ability, not so much him having a world-class live arm who can throw 80-yard, seam throws down the field. Accuracy on short and intermediate throws, and receivers with reliable hands and route running skills. So we're talking deep and intermediate passing from the Air Coryell system, short to intermediate for the West Coast offense. So you can see why you might want two different types of receivers. And it's a whole nother argument that people get drafted into system because they fit the system versus just being best player available. That's not what this video is about. That's a whole nother separate discussion. I personally feel players get drafted into a system because they fit, not necessarily because they are best player available. And this is an exact science why. You don't want someone, you don't necessarily need to have take the top off receiver in a West Coast offense. You just don't have to have it. But in the Air Coryell system, it's preferred. It's specifically not one, but two burners, at least in the traditional sense. And then let's talk about the evolution and influence. We've talked about how it used to be, how it is now. And when the Air Coryell offense under Don Coryell came out in the 70s, the West Coast offense gained popularity in the 80s under Bill Walsh, just like we talked about before in the Niners. They used to run those trap plays with Steve Young and Joe Montana. Beautiful thing to watch. The run, the short pass was an extension of the run, and it was beautiful. The West Coast offense had a more lasting impact on today's game, and it's been adopted by a ton of teams in the NFL. Those short, high percentage passing and timing throws, it's now like a fundamental aspect of many offensive systems, where the Air Coryell really is not. It's not that profound anymore. It's kind of evolved a little bit more. You had your Scott Turners, you have your Kyle Shanahans, and who kind of rely on it, but more of a zone run scheme or outside zone scheme like Kyle Shanahan is. But the Air Coryell system is not as profound in the NFL as it once used to be. So just wrapping it up, the Air Coryell system, it emphasizes the aggressive, long range, vertical stretching of the field. And the West Coast specifically focuses on those shorter, higher percentage passes, precision timing, a balanced run pass approach. The Air Coryell, the numbers for the route tree specifically, as opposed to an arbitrary name. So they would use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, as opposed to a letter or a system like 348 jet, for example. The X would run a 3. The Y would run, the tight end would run an intermediate route, and the Z would run a deep corner route. That's just kind of the different nuances of the way that the Air Coryell system is called versus the West Coast system is called. But let's look at John Matsko real quick as we close this video out. So his upbringing, you got to look at his upbringing to have a better understanding of why exactly he was fired and was not a good fit for this offense under Eric Bienemy. He was Air Coryell to the core, like no pun intended. Okay, listen to this list of previous offensive coordinators he served from. He was our offensive line coach. Let's get that straight. He was not anything world-breaking or earth-shattering. He's been with Ron for a long time, but he was the offensive line coach. And as an offensive line coach, he probably had a specific scheme, the Air Coryell, that he was very privy to. Jerry Rome, the 92-93 Phoenix Cardinals. Jerry Rome was also the quarterbacks coach under the 83 through 87 Redskins. Air Coryell picked it up from Joe Gibbs. We talked about that earlier, right? Carl Smith, John Matsko served underneath him 94 to 96 Saints. Okay, don't really know Carl Smith's origins, but through the Air Coryell system, he got a lot of credit of grooming Russell Wilson in 2012 from 2011 when Russ got there in 12 all the way to 17. I ain't talking about Russ right now. I'm talking about the young early Russ. Jim Skipper. Jim Skipper was on the Giants 97-98. Matsko was there for those 2 years. Underneath him, he was the offensive coordinator for 3 years, but under Jim, it was also under Jim Fossil. And then Jim Fossil ran something what's called the duck offense, which also created mismatches through these unusual formations, but it was very similar to the Air Coryell with regards to mismatching receivers and tight ends against defensive backs and linebackers. Mike Martz, who we talked about earlier, right? Remember him? 99-05 Rams. John Matsko was on that team. He also ran the Air Coryell because that's what he learned back in the day. Bobby Jackson, 2000, 2002, and Steve Fairchild. All those guys ran the Air Coryell system. Mike Solari on the 06-07 Chiefs. John Matsko was the offensive line coach there. Power run game and blocking, sprinkling and inkling of the Air Coryell system. 2008-2010 Ravens. Cam Cameron, offensive coordinator there. Air Coryell. Rob Chudzinski, who I thought was going to be a big contender for our offensive coordinator, but we didn't hear hide nor hair from him. John Matsko was the offensive line coach 2011-2019 under Rob Chudzinski. Zone run scheme, very, very heavy tight end usage. We saw Greg Olson. And then 2013 to 2017 was under Mike Shula, a very, very run heavy. And so you can see where the roots came from. And then let's go back to Scott Turner, 2020 to 2022, the Washington football team and the Commanders. Scott Turner, son of Norv Turner, who was an Air Coryell to the core guy. And then the Commanders, after they fired John Matsko, it wasn't released. They said fired. So I wonder if, John Matsko is not able to coach these smaller, more athletic linemen because you have to move around the West Coast system. You don't have to hold your block for 3 seconds in a West Coast system. In the Air Coryell system, you do. Remember Scott Turner setting up those, 7 to 10 step drops that took 3-4 seconds to develop. And then the linebackers and defensive linemen are already in the backfield because our offensive linemen couldn't hold their blocks. But in the West Coast system, you only have to hold your block for 1.5 seconds and the ball's out. That's how quickly the offense works in the West Coast system. It's beautiful. Okay. But when it was all said and done, Eric Bienemy hired Trevor Wharton. Okay. Who's Trevor Wharton? He was a former assistant offensive line coach who is now promoted to our offensive line coach on the Commanders. He was coach at South Carolina, the Gamecocks, in 2015. And then he became an offensive quality control coach on the Carolina Panthers underneath who? Ron Rivera. 2018, 2019. Then he became an assistant offensive line coach in the Commanders 2020. And he also played for Carolina under Ron Rivera too. So that's the linkage. Ron likes his guys. Clearly he let Eric Bienemy have the autonomy to fire John Matsko because he was with Ron Rivera for a very, very long time. So I think that speaks very highly of what Ron thinks about Eric Bienemy and his ability and autonomy to have a say in personnel systems. So I don't know Trevor Wharton's system per se, but I'd be willing to bet he's going to become a West Coast offense guy, sprinkled in with a little RPO very quickly under Eric Bienemy. So that's just my spin on it. Like I said before, these things, it took me 2 weeks to kind of get all this stuff together. And it's only, here 15 minutes worth of talking, but I really enjoyed doing this. I learned a lot about the two different offenses. I kind of knew a little bit about it, but the nuances of each, and then historical examples of how the Air Coryell system evolved. We saw it in Washington under Joe Gibbs and under North Turner, but never really knew it had that linkage. I knew it linked back to Don Coryell, but not specifically the players, like Kellen Winslow and Dan Fouts. But so I thought it was pretty cool. So I really hope you enjoyed this. I know I did. And this is a quick slant, when we can get a little bit of information out and just have a discussion and put something out there. We'll do it under the quick slant banner. All right. So this was fun. Thank you for tuning in. Please go hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't done already. And we'll be back. We're always live streaming. We're doing pre-recorded videos. We're about 81 days out from the start of the NFL season. So it can't come here soon enough. Thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you on the flip side. As always, peace and hail. We out.